In some terrestrial ecosystems, temperatures and light levels are high, which favors photorespiration. But some plants have evolved the ability to minimize photorespiration in these environments. C4 photosynthesis adds an additional set of carbon fixation reactions that enable some plants to increase net photosynthesis in warm, high light environments by reducing photorespiration. So if photorespiration were not reduced, the photosynthetic rates of C3 plants were going to be relatively low. By having these additional sets of carbon fixation reactions, these species can have higher photosynthetic rates in these places. So for example, when we go to grasslands in South Africa, and this here is Willie Stock, Kendra, myself, and Val, and we're standing in the middle of Shishlewi umphallosi. Almost all of the grasses that are around us use the C4 photosynthetic pathway. You can see that there are very few trees in this environment, and almost all the photosynthesis that would be occurring is going to happen through this C4 photosynthetic pathway. It's a place that's very bright, it's a place that's very hot, and almost everything around us is C4. Now, only 3% of the world's species of higher plant species actually are C4 plants, use the C4 photosynthetic pathway. Yet these 3% of the species produce 23% of the terrestrial GPP. So almost a quarter of gross primary production of net photosynthesis happens through the C4 pathway. And that's almost entirely in these warm, high-light environments, such as tropical and subtropical grasslands and savannas. Now, what's unique about C4s becomes apparent when you compare them to your typical C3 plants. And during the day, you have C3 photosynthesis that occurs within plants, and there's exchange of water and CO2 and the export of sugars. In C3 plants, all of the photosynthesis occurs in mesophyll cells, and that's what this represents right here, is a mesophyll cell. It's a cell within leaves that's somewhere in the middle of the leaf itself. In C4 plants, there are additional cells called bundle sheath cells. The bundle sheath cells are generally adjacent to mesophyll cells, and the pathway for C4 plants goes something like this. Carbon dioxide enters a mesophyll cell and then is fixed into a C4 sugar. This C4 resultant acid is then transported to the bundle sheath cell where it decarboxylates, or the CO2 is released, and that's able to raise the CO2 concentrations in the bundle sheath to very high levels. The C3 sugar or acid goes back and then is regenerated, and this cycle continues, and it keeps pumping carbon dioxide in really high levels into the bundle sheath. And in the bundle sheath is where C3 photosynthesis occurs. So all of those steps that we talked about for C3 photosynthesis that normally occurs in mesophyll cells gets shifted over to these bundle sheath cells, and the mesophyll cells primarily serve to pump carbon dioxide into the bundle sheath cells. When you have these really high CO2 concentrations in the bundle sheath cells, the amount of photorespiration ends up being relatively low because the CO2 concentrations are so high, and rubisco is more likely to serve as a carboxylase than an oxygenase. So what's so special about C4 photosynthesis? It allows CO2 to be concentrated where rubisco actually fixes carbon. So instead of it being below atmospheric concentrations, often the point at which rubisco fixes carbon is in an atmosphere of very, very high CO2 concentrations. And this reduces photorespiration because the likelihood of carboxylation is much higher than oxygenation. Now, it also lowers internal CO2 concentrations in other parts of the cell because we're pumping so much CO2 into the bundle sheath. Because the concentration gradient, if this is your leaf and that's your stoma, when you're pumping all of that CO2 into your bundle sheaths, the concentration here is relatively low of CO2. And what that causes is a much greater driving gradient for CO2 to diffuse into a leaf. The lower the CO2 concentrations in the leaf, the greater the driving gradient and the more diffusion. Since CO2 concentrations are so low within the leaf, for a given amount of CO2 entering the leaf, you can keep your stoma more closed, or have fewer of them open. So in general, having C4 photosynthesis and lower internal CO2 concentrations, not in the bundle sheath, but in the atmosphere of the leaf itself, allows plants to reduce their water loss. And so that ratio of water loss to CO2 gain is a lot lower in C4 plants than in C3 plants. Now there are costs to C4 photosynthesis. Regenerating PEP, that C3 molecule that moves carbon dioxide into the bundle sheaths, is very expensive. And it's estimated that there's a 30% increase in the energy requirements of those leaves that have C4 photosynthesis. So there's a lot more energy that's required to do C4 photosynthesis. But in general, that's more than balanced out by the additional photosynthesis that occurs in a high light, warm environment. So the major advantage of C4 photosynthetic pathway is increased carboxylation under conditions that would normally favor photorespiration. So you tend to find C4 plants where it's hot and where it's bright, like a tropical grassland in the south of Africa. In contrast, it's not favored where it's cold and dark, and these places tend to be C3 dominated. Photorespiration just isn't quite as important there, and there's not much reason to favor C4 photosynthesis in those systems. In addition, since C4 photosynthesis is associated with raising the CO2 concentrations in the leaf, C4 photosynthesis is favored during times of low CO2. And the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere were really low starting about 8 million years ago. And so C4 photosynthesis really became widespread among species at this time. And so C4 photosynthesis and the evolution of C4 dates back relatively far, but really became abundant within the past 10 million years.